Thank you very much, by the way. And thanks for the opportunity to speak with you today. I really appreciate it. I have lived all over the country, and most recently I've been in Knoxville for 5 years. I'll give you my background so you can sort of understand how I sort of got into this area. My undergraduate was in a small liberal arts school studying physics. That was my major, but I always wanted to do weather and earth science. I always loved it. But I did an undergraduate in physics, which is more general, because I eventually wanted to go to graduate school. Took off a little bit of time, then went back to graduate school for atmospheric science. And a lot of programs where you have climate science are not your typical programs. For example, here at UT, if you want to study climate science, you major in civil engineering. It's in the environmental engineering and civil engineering department. And you'll find that at many different schools. I went to Georgia Tech and got my PhD there. Then I took off some more time. I had 2 kids, which took a little bit of time. And then I went back as a postdoc at Los Alamos National Laboratory. That's out in New Mexico. They have a big ocean science group there, and I worked on general fluid dynamics. And then I had the opportunity to come to Oak Ridge and work in the Computational Earth Sciences group. And I tell you that only because climate science is such a broad field. It covers, and in fact, what I'll really call it is not climate science, but earth science. It covers all aspects of the Earth system. And we like to think of it as a whole sort of organism, I guess, although what I can tell you about biology is absolutely nothing. But it covers so many manner of things that we can't be experts in any one, or sorry, over the whole thing. So we usually have certain areas where we tend to focus. Today I'll sort of focus on the computational side, and that's the modeling and different aspects, and show you how it's what we call a multi-physics system. There's many different components that are all working together to give us some interesting results about what might be happening with Earth's system. So first of all, what is climate science? And I show this cartoon. As you know, climate science is a very political topic right now. We try, I can only speak for myself, to separate the science from the politics. Scientists are naturally critical people because we're taught to question. And so it's our job to say, we don't know the answer to this question, so we're going to have a hypothesis and figure out what we think might be happening. And then you do experiments, and you gather evidence, and then you come to conclusions about what that might be. It's not my job to decide what to do with those results. Policy and all those sorts of things are a very interesting field that other people do study. But I'm going to focus today on the science side of it, which is what does the evidence tell us? What does data say to us? And the job of interpretation, to some degree, lies with collecting lots of different studies together and that sort of thing. But anyway, every time we have a heat wave like this, climate change, and then every time it's cold, no climate change. But the fact is, really, you can't tell just by looking outside what's happening to the climate. It's mostly weather. Now, you can look at different plants and things that are growing, but I won't go into that because that's not something I know that much about. But it's important to just sort of remember that climate is very different from weather. Weather follows changes in the atmosphere over time. So day-to-day changes. I took this slide from a couple of days ago because this is a staggering picture of 35 degrees above normal in northern Ohio for March, which is, I mean, that's a season. And as you know, it's been very warm here. Whereas climate, on the other hand, this is the average mean temperature from 1999 to 2008. And that does show that the average temperature over the globe has been warmer than average from 1999 to 2008. But it's been warmer than average. Average is some average, which there's a deviation above and below. So there we go. So it's important to separate weather and climate. And climate is really a field of statistics. We gather many different numbers together, whereas weather is a study of sort of stochastic events. Remember the butterfly effect? A butterfly flaps his wings, and you get a thunderstorm in Indiana. But in fact, that's more of a weather effect, whereas gathering all those statistics is climate. The other way to think about it is to look at what we call a PDF. If you guys have taken statistics, what you do is you say, OK, over a number of days, I have a certain global temperature. So if you average over all of the Earth, you have a global temperature of some amount. Say it's right here where this blue line is. Now, some days it'll be warmer and colder, and there'll be winter and summer and that sort of thing. So you gather a curve which describes the change in temperature, or I should say the collection of all the days of the Earth's global temperature. And it looks like this, a Gaussian. So you have some hot days and cold days, some very hot days and very cold days, but the average sits right here. Now, as an example, say we predict that the Earth's temperature in 2050 will be slightly warmer than it is today, which is what we predict, by the way, in case you didn't know. So you're going to see the same sort of thing, a collection of days where you have hotter days and cooler days. But we don't know what that looks like. We only know that we can postulate pretty confidently that there will be still hotter days and cooler days. But as the temperature warms a little bit, what does that really look like? So you could have a sort of distribution where the Earth's temperature is more even all over the globe. So you have some hotter days and cooler days, but generally it's going to be pretty close to average. So in other words, hey, that's not a bad climate. It'll be 70 degrees everywhere all over the Earth all the time. No such luck, I don't think, but you know. The other option is that you'll have more extremes. You'll have fewer days. This is all the same temperature, by the way. Fewer days that are actually that temperature, but you'll have some very, very hot days and some very, very cold days, colder even than what it used to be. But you have more extremes because the weather might be more violent. So it's not just of interest to us to say climate is warming overall, because really Earth's warming up by a degree or two, which is the prediction for the next 40 years or so. A degree or two doesn't seem like that much, but if you end up having something like this where you have some extreme days and extreme cold days, that's really an impact that we need to know about. And this is all just, the desire is to understand this so we can know how to prepare and what we might expect. So first of all, explain sort of what we know from observations. So climate scientists cover many wide ranges of people. We have people who look at ice core samples taken from Arctic and Antarctic ice sheets. It's really interesting. What they do is they take this huge drill and they go down to Earth's core and they pull out these long cores. 3,000 meters they go down sometimes. I mean, it's unreal how far down they go. And what's interesting is that in here you have little air bubbles that have isotopes in them, and they can measure that and determine the temperature of Earth at that time. Please don't ask me the details, especially you're a chemistry major. I don't want to know that. No, I should say that's certainly beyond my scope today. But you can tell from the constituents of the molecules in those air bubbles what kind of Earth it was. And also, if you can sort of see here, there's rings. What happens is snow falls, it packs down, then you have summer, sun hits. Now in the winter, remember, sun doesn't hit the Arctic and Antarctic. But in the summer, the sun hits the snow and changes the constituency of it. And then winter hits again, more snow falls and packs down and makes these rings, just like on a tree. So you can actually go through these rings and see how much snow fell, so you can see how wet was it, what was in the snow, were there lots of aerosol particles or were there not, things like that. And so it's actually a record of what happened. And you can go back for 400,000 years, which is amazing. And so what you see here is variations. It looks sort of like a heartbeat of cyclical sort of behavior. Now what this is the concentration of carbon dioxide. And what you'll notice is from 4,000 years to the present, the carbon dioxide hits a band here. And the present day, we're now up to almost 600, or sorry, projected. Right here, we're only about 387 parts per million, which is above the historical record for the past 400,000 years. Cool. I don't know how that happened. So anyway, the point is observations tell us two things. One, that the Earth had a different kind of climate that it has today. And two, there's a lot more carbon dioxide in the air than we've seen in a very long time. There's other things that we notice observationally. This is all just collecting data. Overall, glaciers have retreated rather than extended. Some glaciers are extending and some are retreating because locally certain areas are cooling and warming. And global average temperatures have gone up over the past 150 years. And we've also noticed changes in the North Atlantic Ocean circulation. OK, so that tells us that climate is changing. That still doesn't tell us why it's changing. It just says it is changing. Now, as far as the CO2, we could probably postulate as to why. But so what we need are models, because unlike many places, we can't just open up a lab with another Earth in it and do things to that Earth to find out what's happening. We can't do what a lot of other scientific fields can do, which is to replicate it in a lab. You can do it in a small scale. You can replicate, in fact, some interesting things are going on at Oak Ridge. They have a whole forest where they've covered it and then added more CO2 to that forest to see how plants grow in a different kind of CO2 environment. And that's another way to sort of experiment with what the Earth's doing. But on a global scale, we have no choice but to do models. So that's where I get a job. So what we do is we run models. We create a computational approximation to what we think Earth is doing. And we run that model many times. And we change the parameters. And we sort of experiment with that. And that's how we learn about, and that's how we have knowledge about what we think might happen in the future. It also helps us give attribution. It tells us why does the Earth warm? Is it due, or should I say, is the Earth warming because of carbon dioxide? Is it warming because the sun is brighter than it used to be? Or any other number of factors? It helps us sort of tweak the system in different ways to understand why it's doing what it's doing. So the question we want to ask as a scientist, is there a link between rising observed temperatures and increased carbon dioxide? Models can perform these experiments to help us answer that question. So this is a famous paper where they modeled the Earth system. They basically said, OK, let's run the model through the present day where we have data and see how well we can reproduce it. So here you have a model, and you run it through, and then you have your observations. And so you then make a decision, OK, here's my error bars. So here's how accurately my model represents observations. Now, observations have error with them. When you go out and collect data, you may trip over the thing and the temperature moves up. Or your model might have an error in it. So there's error bars. This isn't perfect. But what you want to do is make a judgment as a scientist that I'm doing the best I can with my model, and I have something that's representing Earth's climate as best I can with the resources I have. Then you can say, OK, now I want to change the model. I want to force it and say, OK, I'm going to take out extra carbon dioxide, which is my hypothesis as to why climate is warming. I take it out and I rerun the model. So the observations look the same, but the model shows no warming. So based on a study like that, and there's many like them, that's where scientists come up with the conclusion that CO2 represents a change. And that's not just observationally, but theoretically. We also know that CO2 acts as a retention of heat. It acts as a greenhouse gas. There are many other gases that do that too. But anyway, this is why we use models. This is why models are of interest to us, to help us look at things like this. By the way, ask me any questions along the way. You guys are quiet, so if you want to know anything, just let me know, and I'll certainly try my best to answer. So this is a busy plot, but I want to give you a sense of sort of how we look at this data. So this is a model run we did, I don't know, this was a couple of years ago at a place called NCAR. That's a place that does atmospheric research out in Colorado. And we run the model. This is the model run. And that's what we call a transient. So you have, sorry, I haven't looked at this plot in a while. Oh, yes. So what we do is we run the model for what we call a control. We run it for pre-industrial times during a period when we think the climate was rather balanced. It wasn't warming or cooling, and it didn't have anything such as people or other effects like major volcanoes to change climate in a way. We wanted something that was sort of what we call a steady state. So we run the model for thousands of years like that. It's sort of this steady state, sort of a control. It's your control for an experiment. So then what you do is you run it given the present day circumstances. Now, once you add present day forcings, you want to match present day data. So you hope to match observations doing that. So you run what's called a transient. So you take your model, first of all, and you run your transient that way, and then you subtract out the observations. This is sort of the same data plotted. It's observations on the same grid as the model, and you subtract the two. And you see some places where they match and some places where they don't. And then you do the same thing. This is pre-industrial control minus observations, and then you get this result. And then you take the transient present day run minus the pre-industrial, and you look at the difference. And so then you can say, OK, unlike the case where I was just subtracting the pre-industrial, when I subtract out the present day one, I see a change. I see warming near the poles, not so much in the tropics. And so this is another thing. By running a model, it tells me not just, OK, Earth's warming, but where is it warming? And you can learn some information about that. So I know that's a busy plot, but I just wanted to say this is sort of the process we go through when we're looking at models and analyzing the results. But that's after a lot of work of developing the model to begin with. Go. So when we create a model, and I'll tell you a little bit about what goes into it, Earth is hard. It's really full of stuff and lots of things. And I can't tell you how little I know about what to do to model the Earth. Luckily, I have certain areas I can help. And we have many scientists who go into creating a model of this size. Thousands of scientists go into developing the model that we use today, which has over 1 million lines of code and runs on the largest supercomputer in the world, or it will be declared so shortly. But Earth, as you know, has land surface effects, such as plants, animals, water running off, human influences, snow, ice, and of course, all the things happening in the air, incoming solar energy, output, clouds, rain, snow, and of course, the ocean with little plants and larvae and all the different things that go into an Earth system. It's vast, and we obviously don't model all of it. We try and capture what we think are the most important parts, and we do what's called a scale analysis, where we look at the most important things, and then we add more details and more details until we can get the most accurate model that we can. So what we do is we break down Earth into 5 major components. We have the atmosphere, ocean, sea ice, land, and land ice. And then within each of those components, we have things that go into them. In land ice, we have that land ice, by the way, is ice sheets. Sea ice is ice that sits on the ocean. So if it melts, it just sort of returns fresh water to the ocean. But if you have an ice sheet sitting on land, such as Greenland, that's the biggest ice sheet in the world, sitting on land, when it melts, it actually goes into the ocean and makes the sea level rise. So that's something to think about, but it's different than ice sheets. Then you have land, which has cities. What happens when someone cuts down trees? Well, it doesn't just take away carbon. It actually changes the albedo of the sun beating on the ground without any trees. So like I said before, we take these components. Each one of those model components has a bunch of scientists that are working on it. And each of them have a component, and then we break it down into parts, and we run it on the largest supercomputer. I say that largest. It's actually not technically the largest yet. But we just upgraded the third largest supercomputer in the world here at Oak Ridge National Lab. It's called the XK6, and it's going to be called Titan. It runs 300,000 processors. So that's like 300,000 desktops, basically. And it's going to be enlarged even more. It's going to be what's called a 30 petaflop system. And what that means is you can basically break down all these processors and run individual things, and so that can give you a more complicated model. And so then that can tell you more information about what's happening, and then we can learn more about what's going on with climate. So the reason I just show this plot is when you run each model component sort of does its own thing. So the atmosphere you can run with lots of features or very few features. Like if you're focusing on the land model, you might run a very basic kind of atmosphere, just enough to give you temperature and that sort of thing. But if you're running the atmosphere, you want all the features in it, like lots of aerosols, chemical constituents, ozone, plants, moisture, all those things, and then have a very basic land model, because usually scientists are interested in different things. So it's a component system that allows you to sort of switch out different things. And when you run it on this big system, someone's got to deal with how to run that. If you add lots of features to your atmosphere model, then you better give it a lot of processors to run on, because it's going to be very expensive. Whereas if you have a very simple ocean model, then you only give it a few processors. But this is a whole research field in and of itself, which is how do you actually put this model to use on the computer so that you can actually get an answer in a reasonable time. To run the system of this size, I actually am not sure. This is such a new system. The one it's replacing, the one before ran, it took 8 megawatts of power. It was almost creating its own climate change scenario. So it's huge. And so when you're running 8 megawatts, you want to get the most out of it you can, because that's very expensive to run. Luckily in Tennessee, we have many sources of energy. OK, I'm just going to show this plot because I want you to realize that, OK, if within each component, we actually break it down into a grid. And this is the atmosphere grid. We actually make it a cube, and then we blow it out to a sphere. It's much easier mathematically to model a cube than a sphere. So we take it as a cube, and we can break it down. I mean, it's sort of like the assume a spherical cow that you learn in basic math, right? Assume a spherical cow, and there you go. But this is how we can deal with the atmosphere. The atmosphere has the problem of the pole, because if you sort of model the atmosphere and you have latitude, longitude lines that come all the way up to the pole, then you have what's called a singularity, and all your numerics blow up. And that's really not fun at all. So you have the equations. These equations, by the way, are for modeling ice sheets. Each component, atmosphere, ocean, ice, land, they all have their own equations to model the different kinds of things that are going on. And so each of these models are broken down into points, and these equations are solved on each of these points. That's why it takes 300,000 processors to run it. And so what you can do then is you solve. So here we have velocity, density, that's mass, and this is temperature, theta. So you have all the different things that you care about in a model. So you have an equation for temperature, for velocities, for mass. Obviously, you want to conserve mass. That's really important. Otherwise, we need to talk to Einstein. And then you integrate forward in time. And so you take your model and you solve for all the variables at one time. And then you go forward in time and you solve again, and so on until you get a full climate simulation. The problem is, of course, you want your atmosphere to send information to your ocean, because the ocean needs to know what the atmosphere is doing, such as temperatures and winds. You need to know what the winds are in the atmosphere to talk to the ocean, and vice versa. So then you have to coordinate these equations being solved in another component and have them interact. And that's also another field of research, is how to have these two components talk to each other in a way that's accurate. Because if you get a temperature from the atmosphere that's 3 days old, it's not going to help you much when you need to know what the ocean winds are today. So there's a lot of work to be done just to get these all to sort of talk to each other. The other thing we can do, this is a new way of dealing with the ocean. See this grid here? See how the points are clustered in this region? This actually saves us a lot of computer time. So here, say for example, you want to know what's happening right near the Gulf Stream. Okay? So say you want to know, say you have an oil spill in the Gulf. I know that never happened, but for example, say you had a big oil spill in the Gulf and you wanted to know what would happen. So you want to have more grid points in that region, because then you can have a more accurate solution. And then over here, you don't care so much what's happening in the ocean. You just want it to iterate. So you can have a grid so that you can solve more points there. And that's really important, because it allows us to save time here and focus all our energy in the part of the Earth that we care about. So what I'm talking about now is a shift. All of the things I've been telling you about so far are sort of global climate modeling. What's happening to the whole globe? Is it warming? Is it cooling? Those sorts of things. Now suddenly we're focusing in, and this is the most recent work, is now we're trying to figure out what's happening right off the coast of Florida. Florida doesn't care if the globe is warming if they're cooling by 2 degrees. The animals and the plant life there don't care what's happening globally. They care about what's happening locally, ecosystems and things like that. And frankly, if there's sea level rise, Florida doesn't really so much care, what I mean by care. They don't care if ice sheet is melting, they don't live there, but they care if the sea level rises above their city. So that's why we want to focus sometimes in certain areas to sort of answer new questions, not just whether things are happening, but where and how much. And so in this case, see all the detail in the ocean currents, which you don't have out here? That's what we want to do. And so that's what we've been doing over the past couple of years. Thank you. The other thing is, even though we have those grids I told you about, we still can't see many important things. So if you think about it, climate is all about the sun. So the sun is the source of all the heat that we have. I mean, you can talk about the core of the Earth, but I'm not, because I don't know anything about it. But you have the sun beating down on the Earth and heating it up, and then that heat reflecting out to space. How much stays in the Earth determines how warm we are. And how warm we are depends on the molecular constituents that are going around our Earth. So how many different sort of molecules do you have and what kind? And that determines how much heat is trapped. And a very important part of how heat is trapped is clouds. Think about it. These bright clouds that are at high surfaces, these reflect a lot of energy. So if you have a lot of high clouds, you're going to have a cooling effect. But low clouds down here near the surface actually act like the Earth's surface, and they actually absorb more energy. So it's not just enough to say we can see clouds in our model, but they have to be what kind of clouds, because that's the deal breaker as to whether we know climate is warming or cooling. And also, you may have bright clouds here. Well, look at that little guy. That's one single storm cell. We cannot see that in our grid points, so we have to make what we call subgrid scale assumptions. We say, okay, in a cloud box, we generate statistics. We say there were 3 clouds in that cloud box. There's an average of this much bright cloud versus not bright cloud. There's all these things we have to think about, and they're very important for our final answer. Oh, that's a movie. I didn't even know that. This is a borrowed slide from a colleague. Isn't that cool? So now you're zooming in and seeing that one storm. That was cool. Maybe this one does it too. No. Bummer. OK. That's like a surprise. I love it. OK. Whoa. Now, the other thing, I showed you that grid where it zoomed in and showed you detail. This is a model. We can now also run these models globally at a high resolution. And the reason we might want to do that is because we think that small scale things that happen might feed back onto the globe. And we want to investigate that. We don't know how things, so when we run a climate model with lots of grid points like this, we can start to see hurricanes and typhoons. And this is new. In the past sort of 5 years or so, we've now been able to run the model, and it's actually only been in the past year that we can actually run it for a long time to get climate statistics rather than just weather, to see actually how many hurricanes you can have in a year. Now that we can run this climate model for, say, 10 or 20 years, we can actually gather statistics. So if you have a forcing where the climate's warmer, for example, will you see more hurricanes or fewer hurricanes? Will the hurricanes actually hit land just as much, or will they be encouraged to go offshore, in which case we don't mind so much or care as much that there's lots of hurricanes, or fewer? But we don't know the answer to these questions yet. But now that we can run the model at this resolution, we can start to. Also, you can start to see more interesting things happening in the tropics, which is where all your moisture is. And so those are things we want to start looking at. Now, this is a movie. So this is a high-resolution ocean. Can you see it moving there? Those are the eddies off the coast of Cape Horn. You guys are really far back. Trust me. You can come up afterwards if you want to see the jet stream there. So one thing that's really hard for ocean modelers to do is to capture the Gulf Stream. I said the jet stream. The Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream is a warm current that comes up from the tropics and sends warm air or warm water northward. And the really important thing about that is England. England is very far north, but enjoys a very similar climate to we do. And that's all because, no, come back. And that is all because of the Gulf Stream. It transports hot air up north. Now, of course, I showed earlier that there was some evidence that it might be slowing down. When you have ice melting in the Northern Ocean, ice doesn't have salt in it the same way that water does. So when ice melts, you have all this fresh water on top, and it's not dense. So it stays there, and it prevents the ocean from circulating the way it would otherwise. And that's a problem. So we want to investigate, what does that mean? If we have more ice melting, what will that happen to our oceans? Now, we also have an ice code. This is really cool. These models can actually predict what the thickness of sea ice will be. That's Antarctica, and that's the Arctic, over long time periods. And I just mentioned some of the things here. We have different resolutions of the ice. We can look at the viscosity and the plasticity of the ice. So in other words, when you have winds from the atmosphere blowing over the ice actually piles up. in certain areas. And that's really important because if you have just a shift in the winds, whoa. Oh, I touched it. It's smart. Smart board. Sorry, I've never had a smart board, so forgive me. When you have winds that shift, that can change the layout of where the ice is dramatically. And so we want to understand, well, if you have a wind shift, that's not even a climate change in the sense of temperature, but it does change sort of how Earth responds to changes that are happening in the atmosphere. Now, we also have a community land model. I say community because it's open access, and everybody, many scientists put in information about it. The land model is very different than the other models. It's not fluid like some of the other, like the ocean and the atmosphere, but it's columns. I'm always amazed by how much information there is in the land model. In fact, we have a land modeler in the back. Max visiting us here from Oak Ridge as well. So if you have land questions, he's the man for it. The columns of land cover many, many meters down. So this model actually even contains information about roots and how they soak up moisture under the ground. It talks about what the heat of the the heat of the soil is, because warm, moist air is more likely to be evaporated away. It also looks at different tree heights, what we call the canopy. There's lots of plant life that likes to be under the canopy, and how much sun hits those plants. There's even things of interest when you have a big volcano that goes off, all that aerosol material, all the sulfuric acid that goes up in the air. It makes aerosols that actually cool the Earth for several years. What it does is it filters the radiation. It's sort of like putting a filter over the sun, which plants actually like. They like more filtered sunlight, and so they actually grow and create and suck up more carbon. Well, that's sort of a secondary effect that we didn't know about, forever. And so this is something you can sort of look at with land models. OK, so I said we had all these high-resolution, fancy models. So what we did is, just this past year, we have a new project where we actually put them all together. So we take high-resolution atmosphere, so very detailed information in the atmosphere model. That's what you're looking at here. This is what we call integrated precipitable water. That means you're acting just like a satellite. We're looking through the model and summing up all the moisture so that you can sort of see how much water there is. And the reason we like that is because it looks like Earth that way. Although the color scheme is different here. This looks nothing like Earth when you look at it from space. But it allows us to look more strongly at where the variations are. And then you take an ocean model. So these models are both run with a spacing of the grid. This one is about 35 kilometers. So you can see hurricanes and things like that. And this one is only about 10 or 15 kilometers. So the spacing along the ocean is only 10 or 15 kilometers. And you run them together. You couple them together so that the ocean and the atmosphere are speaking to each other. This is day 1 of the simulation, and this is day 6. I'm zooming in here. This is Australia, by the way. I know I haven't shifted. There's the US, and there's Asia. And there's Australia, and you see that big typhoon right there. Sorry, cyclone. It's a cyclone here. The cyclone, I've zoomed in here so you can see it spinning over the northwest coast of Australia. By day 6, it's moved down here, and it's decayed quite a bit, which, there's storms do. But the interesting thing is when you run with an ocean model, I'm zooming into the exact same location. You see all that warm water here, so it's orange rather than yellow. Those cyclones are fed by very warm ocean temperatures. That's their energy source. In fact, you'll see when they do predictions of hurricanes off the Gulf in the summer, what they're looking at is the heat of the ocean. I mean, they're also looking aloft at the atmosphere, but one of the big things is how warm is the ocean, because that's the sort of source for these hurricanes. And you can see here, by day 6, that heat is gone. That cyclone has sucked up all that heat from the ocean and cooled it at the surface, which changes the circulation. So the point is, when you combine the atmosphere and the ocean together, you actually can see these sort of day-by-day interactions between them. And that's really fun, because now we're starting to see, OK, now we can actually see that if you have changes in climate in the atmosphere, that's going to have an impact on the ocean. And the ocean, as it takes up more heat and more carbon dioxide, is going to change too. And that could feed back onto the atmosphere. And so we can learn more about what's really happening on Earth because we're including more of those feedbacks. And I like to show this slide. I mentioned the oil spill earlier. Sometimes we're called upon to use the climate model for other things. Our colleagues at Los Alamos did this study when they had the Gulf spill. We have this really high fidelity ocean model. So what they did is they injected a dye in the model. They actually just tweaked it with what they call a tracer. So it's a quantity that they just called, strawberry jam or whatever you want to call it. They stuck it in the model, and then they showed how the ocean, they followed the model and its ocean dynamics to see what would happen. So they could actually predict which direction it would go. Now, this didn't incorporate anything like how it would get eaten by plants and other microbial bacteria and things like that. So this obviously, if it were to go on forever, that's what it would do. But it was very helpful because you could see, okay, look at all these detailed eddies and all those sorts of things. You could see that even though the spill was here, you actually could see something down here. It showed sort of information about how Earth was affected by something like this. So we don't just use it for climate modeling, but other things like this. And actually, the weather models are very similar to our climate models. We use them, even though, obviously, as I explained at the beginning, weather and climate are different. You know, we still like to be able to use it for other things when we can. OK, now I'm going to shift gears a little bit. Another project that I work on has to do with ice sheets. And so I want to explain a little bit, because it's very different than what we do in the atmosphere. But you'll hear in the news, this always hits the news, these big ice chunks fall off. Greenland lost 100 square miles of ice sheet, 4 times the size of Manhattan. Boom, and it makes big news, and oh no, the ice sheet. But in fact, this is a very normal thing that happens. And I throw up that slide again, because we don't want to go crazy with, oh, you know, we're losing big ice sheets. That alone doesn't determine whether we're losing ice sheets. I mean, well, what we call is it calves all the time. So it's very interesting to see those big calving events when they break off. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's something due to climate change. So a big question we want to ask is, what is happening to the ice sheets? And so we want to go deeper by adding, first of all, we never had an ice sheet component in our Earth model. So what we've done, a group called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they're the ones that create all the hubbub by actually taking all the information that scientists have collected and then making policy statements. So I don't live on the policy side, but I'm saying these guys have said, we do not understand ice sheets. So they say models yet, this was written 3 years ago, models used to date do not include the effects of changes in ice sheets. So this is an interesting area of research, because we do not know what the effect of having more ice in the ocean is. I mean, we know that the ocean sea level will rise, but we don't really know by how much. And we don't know, for example, there could be feedbacks. Although we know that the poles are warming right now, we don't know how fast the ice sheet will be affected, because other things could come into play. You actually could have aerosols. We have more aerosols in the air due to air pollution. And those aerosols, when they land on ice, make the ice slightly darker. And that changes the brightness, so more heat gets absorbed, which makes it melt faster. But there also could be more clouds over that area, which could reflect heat. So we want to know more about ice sheets. So if you were to take a slice through Greenland, it would look like this. You'd have the ocean, and you'd have mountain ranges. Iceland is interesting. I mean, it's obvious that it's had an ice sheet sitting on it for a long time. This picture doesn't show it as well. But you have big mountains on the outskirts, and then it's low in the middle. Why? The weight of the ice actually pushes down the land to such a degree. And so the physics of ice sheets are you have snow that falls, and it packs down and pushes out. So over time, this ice sheet, it's actually moving. It moves out this way to the edges, where then it melts off. So as it hits the ocean and becomes an ice shelf, it melts off. So what we want to model is this process of impact of snow packing down onto the ice sheet and then moving it out. And I'm sure any of you have seen pictures of the glaciers, and they've showed those time series where they show it moving down and breaking off. It's really kind of cool. It just happens at a very different time scale than oceans and atmospheres. This is brand new, a couple years ago, data for the velocities of ice sheets. So this is sort of information about how the ice sheet velocities are moving outward. You know, there's some parts missing there. I mean, it's really expensive and also quite chilly to go up there and collect data. So we don't know that much, unlike the atmosphere where we have lots of data, and actually not so much in the ocean. But it's really hard to collect data, so we really need to depend on models to tell us. Now they've gone to collect data on the edges because it's easier to do that, but these interior regions, this is actually remote sensing, but it's been hard to collect enough data. So they're just starting to do that now, which helps, but we really need to depend on models not only to tell us what's happening, but also to show observational folks where do we need to go look next. So if our models say, wow, there's one region which is really melting fast, then those observational people will go out there and look in those regions. It helps save money too, because you know where to do research. So our ice sheet model isn't like the rest of the Earth system. It doesn't model the entire globe. It just focuses in on where we have ice sheets, obviously to save computer time. We can run these models at about not yet. We're trying to get it to 1 kilometer resolution. Right now, we're looking at about 5 kilometer spacing and a little bit of 2 kilometer. And this is the observed ice sheet based on everything we could gather. It's not just observations, but it's what we call reanalysis. So it includes a little bit of modeling to help us figure out what the error is. And then that's a similar model run of Greenland. And so you can see we're able to capture sort of the large scale features that you have the sort of slow moving ice in this region and then faster along the edges. There's some famous glaciers here. This is Jakobshavn. There's lots of glacier names I can't pronounce because they're Danish, but there are many of them, and they're very important for ice sheets. So what ice sheet modelers want to know is in certain regions, particularly Jakobshavn, you have these little outlets. These are between two mountains, but it's the regions where the ice sheets are moving very quickly. And so that's what we want to be able to model is what's happening in these regions. How would they change in a different kind of environment? In the warming, would the ice move faster? Well, when ice is thinner, it doesn't move as fast, but it will if it hits ocean, because when ice isn't attached anymore to the land underneath, it will stop moving. And so when it goes out on the shelf, it can really take off, and then it melts more quickly. So I showed this plot at a conference in December, and I love it. It's, again, that spherical cow plot. This is what we were modeling until last year. I mean, I don't know. I was so happy to get that plot, but really it's not going to tell us what we need to know about Greenland, because all these features, this is a lot harder to model because you have all these little topographical differences. So when you're taking those model equations and integrating them, you have all these little features which create anomalies, and that makes it hard to actually get an accurate solution. So I don't know why I like that plot so much. It just makes it sort of me appreciate all the work I put into it. Makes me feel better. Excuse me. Now, when we run these models, this, by the way, this is brand new. We only got this a couple months ago. That is what we call the topographical land near the ice sheet. So this doesn't have any ice sheet data. That's just the height of the land. And this is obviously ocean here, and that's the island off the coast of Greenland. I just blanked on what the name of it. That's the upper part of Canada. But it's really interesting. Remember that bowl I was telling you about? Because the ice sheet sits there, it pushes it down. In fact, you can see in regions where the ice has already retreated, the land is coming up because it doesn't have the weight of the ice anymore. And that's creating a lot of problems for these folks. There's folks that live on the edge here, and the earth is actually moving significantly, and their house foundations are all moving around. But this is really important to get a sense of what's happening right now so we can have a good sort of foundation, what we call an initial condition for our model. This is a slice through the temperature field. The ice temperature is very important. Cold ice tends to stay where it is. It doesn't move. It's not that viscous. But as soon as you warm it up, say if it's near the surface or near the ocean, it really moves more quickly. And you probably can think of that. When you're cold in the morning, you don't move all that fast. But once you get going, you're more viscous and you can move around. So this is a very basic. I show this mostly to say we're still doing a lot of work and we have a long way to go. This is basically saying, okay, you're very cold here in the center of the ice sheet where all the snow is falling, negative 22 degrees. But near the edges and also near the surface, it's insulated. It's actually not as cold down here. And near the edges, obviously, you're almost at zero. But it just shows you, even though this is a very basic layout of temperature compared to what we actually observe, we don't know what the ice sheet temperature is here. No one's ever been to that part of the ice sheet. So we have to make an assumption. And of course, everyone starts with a linear assumption. So that's where we're starting now. But we would love to get more data on that so we would have a better initial condition. This shows the velocity of the ice sheet. So this shows how the ice is not really moving here. This is similar to the plot I showed earlier. It's just a different color scheme. But near the edges, that's where the ice is moving the most, as I showed in that picture before. It's moving outward. And these three plots just shows a cross-section through here. So here you can see a very simple model. That's that circle I just showed you a little while ago, that circular one. So you see how even the velocities are. So that was good to just show us, okay, our model is doing what we want. But in reality, then, what you see is actually velocities that would look more like this. Very slow in the center, and then they speed up along the edges. And we just recently ran Antarctica. We haven't done a lot with this model yet, except to show that we can integrate it forward. We need to find more observations to compare to. So that's the problem when you don't have a lot of observations. You say, great, we ran the model based on what we think the equations are doing, what the Viscosian is. But you get an answer, how do you know if it's right? So validation is something we do with our models to make sure that we're giving it, I showed with the atmosphere, you run it through the present day and see that you match. Well, present day is even difficult. A lot of the data that we have for ice sheets is also only maybe 10 years old at the most. So say you can gather a couple of points to compare to, but they only go back 10 years. So, okay, fine. That ice in that area is either growing or shrinking, but 10 years doesn't give you really enough to know if your model is doing what it should. So we're still working on this. There's a lot to do. So I kind of blew through all that, but I hope it gave you a broad idea of what we're doing in terms of computational science with these global models. I hope you'll ask any questions that you might have. I like to show this plot. we're starting to do, Oak Ridge is a big laboratory. It's like 5,000 scientists. And so we can meet with other groups doing other things. There's a group in a different division that deals with population. They're geographers. And they took this data set of all the population around the Earth and mapped it onto this data set that we had. The orange is lots of population, and the yellow is a little bit less. And obviously up here, this is the Tibetan Plateau. There's not that many people up there. Lots of ice, though. And so what we did is we ran the atmosphere model along with the population data. So what we saw is this is again the water vapor, and it shows a typhoon approaching India. And of course, what we're interested in is if we're going to see under a different kind of climate, if you see these storms moving to the south or to the north, that actually has a big thing to do with impacts. If your storms are coming up here where the largest populations are, that's going to have a huge impact on India's infrastructure and all those sorts of things. Whereas if these storms are going to go south and below, that affects them too. The other thing is it changes the monsoon. So if your moisture is tending to go this way in the summer, but if it starts to veer south, they're not going to get the moisture they need. They depend very, very significantly on the monsoon season coming in a seasonal way that they expect. The significant snowpack up in the Himalayas melts at certain times of year to provide water sources. So we're working with geographers at Oak Ridge along with us to say, okay, now that we think our models are doing this, what can they tell us about what the impacts might be? Thanks very much.
Anybody want to ask any questions? I'm going to ask a really simplistic question. And every time I hear averages, discussion of averages, this crosses my mind.
Yes.
If are averages recalculated, how frequently are averages recalculated? And so are the warming trends then becoming a part of the expectation so that the average is also peaking up?
Yes.
And
this March is below average from the hottest March we've ever had, right? Is that what you mean? Yeah. Averages are very important. It's important to phrase it not so much as above average or below average, but, well, you have to know what you're comparing against, right? So if you want to say, you look at trends, statistics is a very complicated and dangerous game. And as you know, just from politics, you can see people use statistics and all kinds of, what is it, lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? We always have to be very careful in how we create our statistics and present it for research. And of course, it's a whole separate ballgame in how we present it to the public. And I won't even talk about that because it's very hard to convey all these complicated numbers into a way that makes sense and also conveys the point that you want to make without oversimplifying something. And you're right, averages are everything, because when I showed at the very beginning those PDFs, the Gaussians showing the temperature, you know, the average was the same for all of those, but it conveyed a very different kind of message. So I hope I'm answering your question to say, you know, if you take an average temperature over 10 years, whoops, I went too far. If you take an average temperature over 10 years and then you look at another year and you say this particular year is below average, above average, or average along with those other 10 years that you averaged, right? It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter so much which 10 years you take as long as you're consistent. So if I want to say this year is below average from these other years, what does it mean? Why did you take those years? You just have to sort of explain the background of what you're doing. So for example, when we do the present day keeps moving. So we notice that we keep getting new data sets, right? So when we say the average present day record, that usually starts somewhere between 1960 and 1980. A while ago, we actually created an official average, 1981 to 2000. Because that was where the best data was, and we made that the present day. In fact, when you create a new model before it's accepted as a sort of IPCC class model, you have to run that test and show your results relative to everyone else's model. So that's like the official codified average. But if you have extra data, of course you're going to use it when you're doing your own studies, which is, well, what happens if I include all this information from 1960 all the way to 2012, March 27th at 6 p.m., right? I mean, yeah, you have to. So what we do is we have standards that we have to follow. But you also want to make sure that if you're, you know, exploring something more robust, that you sort of explain yourself when you're talking about it. That's not the. I wish that answer were actually more clear, but I hope I'm getting there.
Well, this is a series, and you're the third speaker in this series, and Mac was the first, and he's here.
Did he answer the question better?
I didn't ask that.
No, I'm just kidding.
I wanted to. But you are the third person to show the CO2 slide.
Yes.
And so that's a good slide where you've really got that dramatic. So if you calculated average and suddenly included the most recent data, that would substantially impact the average.
Yes.
Versus if you said, oh, well, that's so aberrant that we're going to take the average from these other
Yes,
years.
and you have to make that decision. Like, say you were looking at that, and then you saw a spike, like somebody dropped the instrument. So say you had a spike that went up to here, and so the scientists made a decision, I think that's actually just a bad ice core. We're not going to use it. Someone makes that decision, right, based on their knowledge of ice cores and that sort of thing, and they say, I'm not going to include that, your average. By the same token, someone could say, I don't believe those results. So you have to have someone who's asking the scientific questions. There is a decision to be made. But even if you include, so if you have this, and you take an average here, and you say this is a deviation from the average, whether or not you include it, it's above average. So it doesn't really matter in that situation whether or not you've included this. Because if you include this over this whole average, then the whole thing would go up slightly. That would be your new average. And you'd still see a deviation from it. You would just have to explain this includes this data or it doesn't. But I mean, yeah, statistics is a tough game because you have to, number one, it's boring in a way to me to think about statistics, but it's crucial. And it's really important for making the point. And it's also the only way you can make a point in a way that's not just heuristic. Well, my brother said it was really hot in Ohio, so climate change is happening, instead of taking tons of data and saying, you know, this is actually what's happening. So it's a challenge, and you're right. It's a simple question, but it's a very complicated one to answer. Yes?
In your field, would you say there's more emphasis placed on increasing resolution of your models or incorporating more variables?
That's an excellent question. So in our field, the past 5 years, it's been all about increasing resolution. They bought us big computers, and we can now do this. So we increased the resolution. Look, we can run the model. But they're like, wait a minute, the answer is not that much better. I mean, you can see hurricanes now where you couldn't before, but globally, your global answer, your global temperature, well, why? Because when you increase the resolution, you can now see things you couldn't before. So now you need to include those things in your model, new variables. So now I can actually see chemical transitions from pollution to aerosols to different types of clouds. I couldn't see that before. That's also more expensive, though. So I may have my bigger computer to run all these points, but then I need to do more work on each of those points. And so each processor has to do more work, and then that takes more time. So it's always a dirty game because there's the people that put in the physics to the models, and then the people who run the models at high resolution. And of course, everyone wants everything, and we have to choose. So you have some people who say, well, I'm just interested in the overall number, so I'm going to run the model just to high resolution. And then others who say, don't care about resolution as much as having all the right variables that I need. And then, yeah, you have to make some sort of decision about how much time you have, how much to add. But we're now coming to the realization, OK, it's great that we now can run the model at high resolution. That research was worthwhile. But now we have to add in all the things we can now resolve properly. Like clouds were the biggest thing that got messed up when we went to high resolution. Because now clouds look very different at smaller scales. I mean, before we'd look at clouds statistically. You have 20 clouds in this box at this time period. But on a high resolution model, you only have 2 clouds. That's not a statistical sample anymore. It's just some guy down the street saying, I see a cloud. So you want to think about a new way to think about clouds because you have them all high resolution. Those are good questions, you guys.
All right, one more. I just can't resist debate. You articulated clearly at the beginning that you're a scientist, not a policy maker. Mm-hmm. But at some point, were policymakers to seek your opinion, how would you approach responding?
Well, so the policymakers have the same problem that we do with computer time. So you have money from taxpayers, and they have to make decisions, so they can't have everything either, right? So we have incomplete information, they have incomplete solutions or tools. So I think what our job is to convey the message properly as to what we think is happening. We have not, I think, done as good a job as we could in explaining all this. And that makes it harder for policy people to make good decisions. You know what I mean? And so I think I would try to do a better job of explaining, here's what we know, and also here's what we don't know. And it's always scary to say what you don't know, because, I mean, scientists, you know, we're nerds. We want to know everything. And, you know, you have to then, I guess, be careful about framing your argument. I have opinions. I mean, I'm a member of the world. I have opinions about how I think things should be done. I think it's important for me to explain what I see, and me, along with others, then make a decision about what to do. I mean, I think as long as the science is taken seriously, that's what I guess I would approach it, to say, please consider this evidence as something that, you know, many, many people have come up with.
All right, well, then thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.